So welcome on in everyone to our new annual tradition started last year of our State of Early Admissions webinar. So to fill you all in, we've always done a State of Admissions webinar, typically in like April, May time, when we've had kind of um, the full landscape of admissions for the year revealed to us. We know where all of our students got in, and we're able to kind of dissect and digest the data. And we had the idea last year of, why don't we do this for the early deadlines? Because people are very curious and it's one of our most well-attended webinars. We've got some great attendance tonight, so clearly people are excited about it. And we're excited to talk to you about it as well. As far as introductions go, my name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director here at Ivy Experience. I directly oversee our test prep and subject tutoring. And then I also do a lot of our business partnerships with schools, with the independent college counselors and things like that. And I also serve on the board of the National Test Prep Association. Alyssa, why don't you introduce yourself next?
Yes. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Alyssa Coltrane. I'm the Director of College Admissions for Ivy Experience. And what that means, besides, of course, working with our students in every stage of the college applications process, from talking through the college list and recommendation letters, through essays and applications and deferrals. I am also the person who runs the essay teams, make sure all of the wheels are greased and things are going smoothly for everyone, minus the math part. I'll let Jim handle the test prep. You don't want me with for math.
I second that. I also don't want to handle the math part, so call Jim for all math related questions. Uh, I'm Eric Carlin. I'm one of the co-founders of Ivy Experience, and really excited to be here tonight. As a kind of way of introducing myself, I also want to introduce our company and our group, and for those of you who may be new to Ivy Experience and our group, just to show you some background on why we're able to talk about this tonight and why we want to talk about this tonight. So, Ivy Experience was started in 2010. My business partner and I opened this as a really small mom and pop shop in the greater Philadelphia area, which is why we love the Eagles so much. And for those of you who signed on for the pre seminar banter, and our vision was really to be able to provide an array of services so that families could pick and choose what they wanted to work on with us and what made sense for their students and their families, but also have the ability to do everything with us so that they could really build a close relationship and trust throughout the process. This means for ninth and 10th graders that we offer personal advising meetings, which are hourly meetings where we talk about academic planning and extracurricular goals. As I talked about in my TEDx talk back in 2018, this idea of better person, better applicant. It means that in 10th grade, when PSAT and PACT and students start to think about those tests, the SAT and ACT, Jim and the test prep team send out diagnostics that we grade and evaluate for free for any student. And then you can have a meeting with Jim or another member of our team to go over a recommendation, and we offer that. And then finally, as Alyssa alluded to, we have an amazing team that she oversees for that counsels students throughout the essay and application process, which starts in 11th grade. And that's really the bridge to what we're talking about tonight, because we've just finished with the seniors recently, months and months and months of getting to know students, building that trust, building relationship, having the students write their personal statements, all their school specific supplement essays, filling out the activity description and all the other written parts of the application. And now we're here. And early decision and early action applications, those decisions have been released.
All right.
Most
So,
and there's deferrals, which we'll get to.
One quick housekeeping note before we jump into things.
mhm.
Please, please, please drop all of your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we do plan to stick around as long as there are still questions coming in. We will answer them all at the end of the presentation because you'll find that, you may come up with a question, but we're already planning to answer it later. So we wait till the end of the presentation to answer all questions, but please, please, please drop them in the chat. If you have a question of a more personal nature that's specific to your student and you don't necessarily want to put your student's details out there in front of a virtual group of 150 people, then feel free to email us, and you'll have our contact info on the last slide.
And to be clear, we are everyone here, you're coming from all across the country and around the world. We've had students in more than 40 states and 20 countries over the past 15 years. And like every webinar we do, you're welcome. If you have a friend, you can send them the link. They can still sign on. If you have a friend or know someone who wasn't able to make it, this is going to be recorded. We'll be sending out the recording probably tomorrow, I would assume, and it will be available on YouTube. So we really love doing these webinars. Should we get going and talk about early decision, early action?
Let's do it.
Oh boy.
Absolutely. So to start off with just some quick definitions, because of course I am on the word side of things. The types of decisions that we're talking about tonight are going to be early action and early decision. And while both of these have that shared element that students apply earlier, deadlines for early decision are almost always November 1st. For early action, it can be a little bit more loosey-goosey on how much time a student has. I know Georgia and Georgia Tech will officially always be on my naughty list for moving up their deadlines. The major difference is early decision is a binding agreement. Essentially, a student can apply to one early decision school, and in doing so, they make a commitment that they will attend that school if they are admitted. Early action, and this is something that's going to be more common in those big state schools, and we'll talk about that and the draw of those big state schools a little bit later. It is not binding. You apply early, you hear back early, but students still have until that final decision date of May 1st to make a decision about what school that they are going to commit to. And this distinction is important both for students and universities because of the different weights that get given to these decision types. For early decision, when a school is looking to protect their yield, and here I'm going to back up and define another term. We've all seen the US News and World Report rankings of all of the schools, the top 50 national universities, the top 50 liberal arts colleges. And there are a lot of different factors that go into how those decisions are made. We could do an entire webinar just on that and some of the wild things that get factored into this. But one of the major components is something called yield. And anyone who has ever organized a wedding or a big event where you have to worry about the number of people you're feeding is familiar with this idea. Of the number of people you invite, how many of them ultimately say yes and ultimately end up going? And of course, for highly prestigious schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Duke, the weddings of the century here, that yield is going to be higher. Most students who get into Harvard, perhaps unsurprisingly, end up attending Harvard. So US News and World Report takes this as a sort of a correlative for prestige. If you have a high yield, you have to be a good school, which leads certain schools to realize that you can do it the other way around. If you can find a way to artificially increase your yield, perhaps by more heavily admitting from pools where students have committed to attending, if you're accepted, you're going to drive up that yield and signal to US News and World Report and everyone who reads that magazine that you have a higher level of prestige. And we pulled up a couple of examples here just to give you a few examples. This is just our annual dragging of Tulane University, which is a wonderful university, but they do this. Um, the numbers that you see here, so Tulane last year admitted 57, had a acceptance rate of 57% in their early decision round of those students who committed to attending Tulane if they were accepted, and then an acceptance rate of 13% for their early action round. And I suppose we do have to give Tulane their props. They admitted a red hot 200 students in the regular decision round this year, as opposed to, what was it, sub 100 last
Yeah,
year?
probably either like 2 years ago or something. It was only 100 students accepted regular decision by the time they were done with early decision two, which I don't even know what time to get into that, and early action.
Yes.
It was wild. They got a lot of flack for that.
Yes. And there are, Tulane we're ragging on a little bit because it is a more extreme example, but you can even see this with, University of Virginia, where although the difference is more moderate, there is still a notable difference between acceptance rates in early decision rounds versus early application rounds. So those are just some terminology we wanted to talk about, introduce the idea of yield because we'll talk about it more later on. And then I think we wanted to talk about some more general trends about applications as well.
So, the common application, which is for parents who haven't gone through this process and students who haven't gone through this process yet, it's the application platform that you use to apply to most schools these days. They release data every November 1st on the number of students who have applied by then. And so we digest that and share it here. Now, I want to keep in mind that the data I'm about to share is about all applications submitted by November 1st, which means it's not strictly speaking only about students who applied for an early action or early decision deadline. They could apply to a college that doesn't have early action or early decision and submit it in October, and they'd still be factored in here, but it's the best proxy we have for the number of students who are applying specifically for those early action and early decision deadlines. And what we saw compared to last year was a 6% increase in unique applicants who submitted at least one application by November 1st. So more students are getting savvy to applying to college earlier. This is a trend that's continued pretty much the entire decade that I've been in this business. We've seen a 10% increase in the total number of applications submitted. This is significant because you'll notice that the number of applications submitted is increasing more than the number of applicants, right? And what that means is that students are applying to more schools for these early deadlines as well, a pattern that we've seen really start to balloon since the COVID pandemic. And that results in a 3% increase in the number of applications per applicant. And then finally, one of the interesting trends this year is that for the first time since 2021, the growth of applicants submitting test scores has outpaced the growth of applicants who withhold test scores. So I want to break that down because it's kind of a complicated little snippet. Why is 2021 significant? 2021 was the last year we saw a massive increase in the number of students applying with test scores because in 2021, some students were actually able to test again, right? Starting in March of 2020 and through application deadlines in the fall, things were very shut down in most places, and most students just could not sit for an SAT or an ACT if they wanted to, right? And then the 2021 application year, things were very shut down in blue states, less shut down in red states. A lot more students were able to take and submit test scores. So we saw a huge increase that year. And then incremental growth since. Now, because the number of applications are growing, the number of students applying both with and without test scores has been growing every year. But this is the first year since that initial bounce back from no testing during the pandemic that students submitting test scores are growing at a faster rate than students who don't. And we're going to break down some test optional trends a little later in the webinar, but I did just want to bring that to everyone's attention.
Yeah, we're going to get back to that in just a second. But I think the theme of tonight is while we're going to acknowledge the macro stories, which are essential, it's worth noting that while everyone wants to paint this in broad strokes, like what's the expression we hear year after year, right? This is the hardest year in admissions ever. Um, and in a macro sense, that's true, but that's also woefully unhelpful when we're trying to have a webinar tonight and you're all here and trying to understand how does this impact my student? What does that mean? And it's worth noting that there's the macro stories and the micro stories. And Jim's about to take us on a, fun, interesting journey related to grades and testing and some of the macro stuff. But a lot of tonight is going to be the micro stories of schools and minor trends. This is just one example we wanted to start with tonight. If you look at this, these charts here, what you're seeing is over the past couple of years, Brown and Yale have actually gotten less rejective, early decision and early action, if we want to call it that, right? Um, Brown's quite a striking number, almost 18% early decision acceptance rate this year. And then it's interesting because you look at, Duke and Emory, which have gotten, more competitive over the past few years. And Duke is an 11% early decision acceptance rate. And to me, this says two things, right? Number one is people are so quick to just stereotype, and lump together the Ivy League, right? And as if those are the 8 hardest schools to get into. They're not, right? We haven't even mentioned MIT with its whopping 6% acceptance rate, early action. And then the other trend I see here is that these warmer weather schools, especially ones, I know this doesn't count Emory, but especially with ones with an element of school spirit and AKA a really good football team or a football team, are some of the hottest schools in the country and becoming the most competitive on a year-to-year basis. We'll touch on this more later, but it's important to understand these micro trends. And when you're going through this process, you can't just say, well, X, my neighbor's kid last year, my cousin 3 years ago, these were their results. It could wildly change school to school, even over the course of a year or two. Um, Jim, do you want to go back to the macro with grades and test scores, which are the two quantitative pieces of the application they're scrutinizing?
Absolutely. So, if there's only one trend that I could alert a family to who's going through this college admissions process for the first time, I think it would be grade inflation. The numbers on this graph, I'll just kind of explain them. In 1966, your average GPA or rather, let me rephrase that. The percentage of college freshmen who had at least an A minus average in high school was somewhere around 20%. Now it's over 86 or over 85%, almost 86%. And what that means is that, parents will call us and say, my student's a really strong student, A's and a couple B's. Well, what that actually means is that your student is not in the bottom 14% of students because that's an A minus average if you have mostly A's and a handful of B's. So the way that students are able to distinguish themselves with grades, it doesn't exist in the same way as it has in the past because with grade inflation, you end up with something called grade compression, meaning that there isn't really much of a spread of GPAs that students are applying to college with anymore. The GPAs are all clustered at the top.
And
This is
this is
especially
why
true of more selective schools.
And this is why with the ways to even distinguish at the top, it comes down to these questions we talk about with students so often in personal advising meetings and with our essay students, right? How many APs do I take? How many IBs do we take? If you have an IB curriculum in school, that age-old question, is it better to take the AP class and get a B, or the regular honors class and get an A, which the snarky admissions officer answer is always take the highest level class and get an A, which is not helpful. Um, but without getting like bogged down into that, one thing that did come out of some of the early admissions data that was released, just to illustrate Jim's point of the importance of the A versus, when Alyssa and I and our essay team are meeting with students, the first question we ask in the initial consult is, how are your grades? And a lot of people default to giving us their GPA, and we say, no, 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 we want to know how many A's versus how many B's. That distinction is really important. And this was illustrated beautifully by University of Georgia when they were releasing really what their rubric is for grades a couple months ago. And that's exactly what they do. While there is weighting and they do recalculate every student's GPA to their own scale, because some schools are on a 4.0, some schools are on a 100 scale, they're looking at those A's and they go, you get this many points for an A. I think it was like 4 points for an A, 3 points for a B, 2 points for a C, anything in that range. And I think that just underscores Jim's point with the grade inflation and the importance of the A's and being in the A range. Like, this is how colleges are processing it.
Yeah. And
And
I believe the specific point Georgia was making is that they actually, the way they calculate GPAs, I believe they give a 2 for a B instead of a 3 for a B
Mm,
in order to try to spread out the GPAs and actually make them tell them something so they're not all so compressed at the top.
yeah.
and before we have anyone looking at, that B that happened in, freshman year math because math is hard and, transitioning into to freshman year is hard. I think it's also important to understand that admissions officers are looking at a full transcript and that they are people and want to accept people. They're going to look at a transcript and go, the person that I am seeing in junior year, in the first half of senior year, who, ideally has turned things around and is earning those A's, is much more like the person I'm going to get on my college campus because, just neurologically, there's so much growth that happens between like 14, 15 and 16, 17, 18 to go, I'm going to get fall of senior year student on my campus, you know, and I see those A's, and that makes me feel better about, the couple of B's in freshman year. Sure, straight A's across the board will probably be our ideal, but that upward trajectory tells a story that is positive and is hopeful.
Right. Now, if we compare the trend in grades to the trend in test scores,
Yeah.
standardized test scores are standardized. And what that means is that I show here the average ACT scores from 1990 to 2023, which is the last complete year that we have data for. And the average ACT score nationwide, the reason I use ACT instead of SAT, by the way, for our people who live in SAT country and don't know much about the ACT, is just that since 1990, the SAT has reinvented their test multiple times and changed their norming process for the test so that scores from 1990 actually don't mean the same thing as scores from now. The ACT makes small changes to the curriculum that its test covers, but its actual scoring system hasn't changed once in this time period. Um, it will change next September. We just did a webinar on the enhancements to the ACT coming. If you're a freshman or a sophomore family, especially, I recommend checking that out on our YouTube page. But I digress. The average ACT score in the country hasn't moved from between 21.5 and 19.5 the whole time. And we can actually see a more recent downturn. Most people in the industry would attribute this to pandemic learning loss from when students and schools were forced into, an online mode of instruction that they weren't ready to handle. And students definitely ended up with a lot of gaps in, especially in math, I would say, during that time, but also in reading skills, which are, of course, two of the most fundamental skills you can have for these standardized tests. So, test scores offer colleges a way to kind of keep things standardized in a world where GPAs aren't as descriptive as they were because there's so much compression at the top. And then when we talk about test optional, I want to be clear about one thing that test optional exists on a spectrum. So basically, you're going to see that there might be three test optional policies out there, that some colleges are test optional, some colleges, require the scores, and some colleges don't use them at all, right? But if we go to our next slide, we'll see that really, test optional covers a broad spectrum of institutional philosophies on test scores. So you have some schools, like for instance Duke, where they're really pretty much test required with some rare exceptions. At the last time that Duke released data on this, it was over 90% of their freshman class had submitted test scores as part of their application, right? That is not the same thing as a college that accepts 50% of their students with test scores. Their actions are telling you one thing, their words are telling you another. Test optional just means we will process your application and take your fee whether you send a test score with it or not. They're not telling you anything about what it does to your chances of admission. You have some schools that would prefer tests, and I would say most test optional schools are in this realm where if you can submit a score that that school considers strong, excuse me, considers strong, then that's going to help your application. And then you have some schools that are truly test optional. I think the best way to see if a school is truly test optional is if they were test optional before it was cool, meaning before the pandemic forced everyone into test optional and colleges stuck with it because it helped them suit various goals of their own. So college like Wake Forest, right? A lot of the small liberal arts schools like Bowdoin. These schools were test optional before the pandemic, and they truly believe that that's a valid way for them to find the best applicants. The test required, if we go to the next slide, um, test required is coming back, and I have up here a slide from our last state of admissions where we were seeing this like surge of headlines that were protesting. And previously, as a test prep professional, my industry was quite maligned in the news, I'll say, and you would always hear from people speaking out against standardized testing and all the bad that it does. But it turns out that in this post-pandemic world of rampant grade inflation, standardized test scores are very, very useful. And so if we go to the next slide, we have
Also, by the
many
way, could
colleges. Oh, go ahead, Eric.
I'll I was going to say also with the rise of AI, which is a whole separate thing we're not going to talk about tonight, but
Yeah,
test
exactly.
scores are coming back.
Yeah, there's not a way that I know of yet for AI to take your standardized tests for you. Um, Now, generally speaking, when we talk about the colleges that have gone back to requiring test scores, and I have here just a list of, I think, some of the most popular ones that have in the last year. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these would be the bigger names that our students tend towards. So many of the public schools in the South, so University of Texas at Austin and pretty much the whole Georgia system, um, and then in terms of private schools, mostly highly selective schools, which we'd qualify these first for as Carnegie Mellon, Johns Hopkins, Caltech, Stanford. University of Miami is a selective school, but it's not quite as challenging to get into as those other four. And it's interesting because University of Miami, it has a lot of things in common in the way our students perceive it with some of those large Southern state schools. You get your rah-rah, you get your ranked football team, you get
Weather,
the, what was that?
good weather.
Good weather. That helps. Yeah. But most of the schools that we've seen go back to outright requiring standardized testing fall into kind of those two categories, your large southern state schools and your highly selective schools. So if you know that either of those two categories is going to feature prominently on your college list, it means that test optional is probably not really going to be an option for you. Whereas, for a lot of students, you can craft a list with a test optional plan. For most students, we definitely recommend at least trying both tests, seeing where you land, and then having an honest conversation with the family of, what would it take to get this score to a point where it would be an asset at the schools where you're interested in applying. And that's something we do with all of our students. We offer free diagnostic testing. And then after that, a free call with me where we just talk through like, what's realistic from here? What should the plan be? And believe it or not, even though I'm a test prep professional, I do sometimes recommend that students go test optional if it's right for them. So we'll move now to the conversation on early action and early decision and what we saw specifically from this realm. And in this phase of the webinar, I will move to more of a moderator role since this is more of Alyssa and Eric's forte. We have here the four kind of big hitting topics that we want to cover. and we'll keep these slides up. But from here, a lot of the webinar will be more kind of conversational in nature. And we'll start by talking about trends in standardized testing. So basically, we saw two very popular schools, private schools, University of Miami and Boston University, come out with strong statements about their standardized testing policies. We had Miami go back to requiring tests, and we had Boston University extending their test optional policy. And I think my point here is just that, parents have told me all kinds of crazy things on the phone, like, oh, I think everyone will probably be requiring it by the time my freshman applies, right? Because that's how the chips are falling. No way, right? Or, can you tell me if you think this or that school will go back to requiring the test? No, I won't even try to tell you that kind of thing. The moment I hear, I can tell you, but and I'll keep my ear to the ground. But the point is, no one has a crystal ball on this stuff. And, we're following these trends as closely as we can. Sometimes we might get rumblings through people we know in the business about a school thinking about the decision one way or the other. Or we might hear from a parent who heard something on an admissions tour that some, tour guide said before the school made an official announcement or something like that. But really, when it comes to these policies, schools decide for themselves based on their own institutional priorities, and we have to wait and see what those decisions are.
It- And we could be singing in an entirely different tune in April when we do the overall state of admissions for the year after the regular decisions come out, because, you know, one of these schools could be changing their policies, especially with the ACT going digital completely, as an option for the current sophomores. Jim and one of our colleagues, Tori, did an awesome webinar on that for anyone who is still unsure and needs to navigate the ACT. But what ends up rolling out with that could influence colleges to change their policies. I mean, the only thing we can really say right now, when you look at Miami and BU making the divergent decisions that they did, is that it still seems regional. Now, whether it's public or private, overwhelmingly the universities that are going the test required or have already gone are in the southeast of the United States, and remaining test optional are not in the southeast of the United States. It's not exclusive in either case. And we could see what happens, right? It's only going to take a couple of schools to potentially break that trend in any given region or any given conference.
And I think a lot of schools really are biding their time to sort of see what other schools are doing and then make a decision. Because, one of the things that we do once our seniors have started to submit applications, and things die down a little bit, is on our end, we take that time and we start doing research. We start looking into what's changing, what's going on. And one of the things that, we asked a colleague to take on for us this year was compiling a list of our top, it was some very weird specific number, I think 147 schools, the top 147 schools that our students apply to, and go, what is their test optional policy? And I remember speaking with her, and she told me the most frustrating part about that was seeing all of the, temporary test optional policies that were going to expire fall of 2025 without any follow-up on what that was going to be in late 2025, in early 2026.
And I think that's really the trend, right? Is that the universities are not at all forthcoming about what they are thinking about testing or what the data's been. Someone asked, like, what's the cutoff and when do I submit the score? So first of all, that question is so individualized in every single, it's not even about the student. It could be the student in each individual school to which they're applying, right? You need to know, the student's grades, their rigor, the everything else going on with the student and that university to which they're applying. But then the biggest obstacle is that, you think about it, and deciding whether or not to submit that test score, if it is borderline, is a really data-driven decision. And we covered this a lot in a previous webinar where we broke down and did a lot of analysis and went through, I don't know, 147 universities, but it was a lot. And, I think I could count on my hands, maybe a couple toes, how many schools had released any data on how they handled, test optional. To Jim's point earlier, the one overwhelming insight was, hey, schools would prefer that you submit a test score versus not. When in doubt, submit. And that's the best takeaway we can give still to this day because there's still an enormous withholding and lack of transparency with test scores and how they handle test optional.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Eric means if a student's on the borderline of what would be a submittable score at a college, err on the side of submitting it. If it's low enough, then it does make sense still to withhold it. So it's not that they always want to see a test score. It's just you should always give them the chance to give you credit for your test score if they might.
And interestingly, Wisconsin, when, and we're going to get to deferrals later on, but just to this final, I think, final point on testing, and then no one likes thinking about testing too much, so we should probably move
Except
on,
for me.
but except for you, right? Um, but if you get deferred, if nothing else, the school's going to say, send us your first semester senior year grades, right? But Wisconsin was interesting. They said, and if you haven't sent us your test scores already, or if you'd like to add your test scores, you can. And I thought that was such an interesting signal they were sending with, they were saying it without saying it. It's like, can you please do this? It would be helpful as we make this decision. Um, I will say, well, we'll get to that, the importance of first half senior grades later. So, unless you want to
Yes.
talk about how it gets harder every year.
Yes. So this is one of those moments where we really wanted to talk about the macro story versus the micro story, because in this moment we have two macro stories that seem to be sort of colliding with each other. That for many students, it feels like it gets harder every year. And we're going to talk about a couple of schools this year where it has notably felt like it's gotten harder in a moment. Where schools that an older sibling applied to and maybe got into, or older friends applied to and it felt more like a target school or a likely school, now are feeling more the targets have become reaches, the likelies have become targets as more and more students apply to those schools. But at the same time, we also have this trend where we are reaching a demographic cliff. This is, I believe, the high school seniors of this year will be the largest group of high school seniors to graduate for a while. And
Yeah,
after the
if I could put it in perspective with some numbers. So 18 years ago was 2007, and what is really the cause of this demographic cliff was a decline in birth rates caused by the Great Recession in '07, '08, '09, right? And that trend actually continued. Birth rates didn't rebound when the stock market did. And so what that means is that potentially by like around 2040, some demographic estimates say that there may be as many as like about 15% fewer 18-year-olds in those years. So we're going to see for the first time in a long time the college applying population steadily decrease over time. This is offset by a couple other things. I mean, one, we're seeing more students apply to more schools, right? So the number of applications may not go down immediately because if this trend of students applying to more schools continues, that means that that might offset, this declining birth rate because it's not gonna, we call it the demographic cliff, but it does, that 15% happens gradually over years. It doesn't happen overnight. Um, And then the other thing to consider is just that, and I think especially parents to put it in perspective, I mean, my dad says all the time, I would never get into Villanova now, right? And parents, I feel like most of you have probably said some similar version of the same thing about your alma mater, right? And the truth is, college used to be a very regional thing. My dad grew up in the Philadelphia area. He applied to Villanova. He was a Catholic kid from Philadelphia. That's what you did, St. Joe's and Villanova, right? And that is not true anymore. The best students in Chicago, LA, New York, Philadelphia, name your city, all apply to the same handful of schools, right? The world has shrunk.
Globalization is something that the higher education industry is not immune to. So when you can, please no one pull up Kayak and quote me on the ticket price here, but when you're a student from California can fly to Duke for $300, suddenly sending them to Duke doesn't seem like, you know, an unreasonable option
Yeah,
anymore.
especially when you pay for it with credit card points. Am I right? Um,
But what's interesting is at the same time that we have more and more students applying to these big universities because we've had that resorting where the top students from all over are now applying to, the same set of 50, 100 schools. You have smaller schools struggling. We've seen that happen a lot. For those of us who are local to the Philly area, we just saw Villanova University absorb Cabrini within the past year. And I know, Eric, you had just had a conversation with a colleague about Northeastern making some additional acquisitions, right?
Yeah, I mean, Northeastern for a while has been expanding to be like this global campus, right? Don't even want to get into the fact I think they literally hired one of the original Moneyball people to manipulate their yields. So they dropped into single digit acceptance rates. But, they have these global campuses and technically like the decision doesn't count towards the data if the student doesn't attend the flagship campus the fall of freshman year. It's crazy. All of this is to say is that they're international. Well, now Northeastern has bought Marymount College in New York City, which is fascinating because there's, I think, an NYU or an NYN program or something like that, where some students are starting their first semester in New York and then will move to main campus. But any Marymount student right now, by the time they graduate, if this deal is approved, will graduate with a Northeastern University degree. So it's this interesting trend right now, and we'll see if this expands of private institutions that are doing well, buying out other private institutions that are not doing as well in this current state.
And Northeastern is king of the rankings game. Like all props to them. Part of playing that game involved endowing dozens of professorships and really making an effort to improve their academics as well. But yes, to your point, one of the things that gets factored into those rankings is the average SAT score of students who are on the flagship campus in the fall of their freshman year, which means anyone who is not on that campus in the fall of freshman year, that SAT score isn't factored in. So it gives Northeastern a way to account for that freshman melt. People drop out in their first couple weeks. It happens, but also to shuffle things around and play a little bit of that shell game when it comes to driving up that average SAT score. I think one of the other components that we wanted to speak to, this idea of getting harder every year. I think Florida was one of those schools where for students it just felt like Florida got harder. And
Yeah.
this is something that, we're seeing in that trend of the schools that students are looking for. They are looking for warm weather, but solid academics, with enough spirit that they can, go and tailgate and still get a great education. And Florida, in many ways, fits exactly that kind of category.
Yeah.
And I
And
think
this,
we saw that come out.
yeah, and I think it was, the most notable and most painful one for a lot of families this year who we worked with. I mean, it's not limited, right? You can see on the slide here, right? South Carolina. I mean, so many deferrals, right? It's was already an attractive the other boxes to checked, just keeps getting more competitive as everything around it keeps getting more competitive. Clemson, same. University of Tennessee, same. But one point before I throw it back to you with Wisconsin and Texas, with Florida was, I was talking to an admissions officer there the other day, and to that point of it gets harder every year, what does that mean? You know, she started by talking about how, look, there's over 90,000 applications now, right? Which Texas Austin said the same thing, right? It's just more applications than they've ever dealt with by far. Um, but I think an important point building off the earlier part of this conversation is she said, look, we're not just looking, accepting students for numbers, right? We're not just accepting them for their grades and their test scores. And she said, the essay counts as much as the other stuff, and students don't realize that. Um, when I said, like, just prodding a little bit, I was like, well, just to get it out of her too. I was like, well, what are you? And she said what we've, all known here for a long time, right? She said students are writing essays, when Florida asks in their supplement essay, write 250 words about the most meaningful activity to you and elaborate on that. They don't want to hear about the activity. They want you to choose an activity that's a portal to highlighting you and understanding you. And she just said students write these essays and they don't even talk about themselves. So, it really underscores, people say, oh, these big schools, are they even reading the essays? They are, which is why it takes so long, which is why, you know, I would like to believe that every application submitted early action is read, but this is why people grumble every year and say, did every application get read? Right? Or is that why there's so many deferrals? Do they just need more time to process every application and read it? But I think, admissions officers get a hard time. They are just people at the end of the day, and they really are looking at this process holistically, and they really count that stuff. They really value it and want to connect with the student. So.
And when it comes to sort of almost actionable items, before we move on to talking about the Wisconsin guarantee. So we've talked about this idea of one of the reasons why it feels like it gets harder every year is because the college search has become globalized. You can get on a plane and fly. It's now feels more and more normal to to travel away from your local region when it comes to college. That's why, especially with this trend towards warm weather, we saw Clemson make huge strides in, how selective that it was. I think we're seeing University of South Carolina poised to make that same kind of movement. I'm sure there are others coming up behind. I think College of Charleston is going to do its best to make that play. But in many ways, the way you counteract globalization in almost every industry is to shop local. And there was, one of the things we do when it's a little quieter is we keep up on what's going on, what's being published in our industry. And our co-founder Karan talked about thinking through where you want to live after college. And if you're, if you're from the Philly area and you're looking for a strong alumni network, you know, maybe it's not necessarily going to be the big school, even if their business school is really strong. If you're going to be in the Philly area, I think you're going to run into more Villanova business alums or more Penn State business alums than you're going to run into Michigan Ross necessarily. It is certainly not to downplay the academic caliber of any of those schools, but thinking through in a very local sense, what is it that I want out of a university can be something that helps guide that college choice and helps you flesh out some of those targets and some of those likelies. And this is my segue into talking about Wisconsin and Texas. It's something that I think a lot of in-state universities are trying to encourage their students to do. And this is something we saw happen in Wisconsin because this is the Wisconsin Guarantee, is the University of Wisconsin's enactment of a piece of legislation that was passed last year, um, in which the Wisconsin Guarantee offers admission to all Wisconsin high school graduates in the top 10% of their graduating class. One small caveat there. You have to be in the top 10% to gain admission to any University of Wisconsin campus if you want to attend University of Wisconsin-Madison, their flagship campus. That's going to be in the top 5%. So suddenly, University of Wisconsin-Madison has all of these students that it has to automatically admit. And interestingly enough, this only applies for Wisconsin students who apply on or before the early action deadline. So what do you do when you have to admit massive numbers of Wisconsin students in your early action deadline? You suddenly need to defer a lot of your out-of-state applicants. And I think this is something that, we saw happen with the UT Austin's, with the UT system and UT Austin when Texas automatic admissions came into play. This is something that university system has been doing for a while. So it will be interesting to see if we see Wisconsin going in similar directions and how that regular decision round plays out. Because Wisconsin-Madison now has done what it needs to do as far as its in-state applicants. And I wonder if we're going to see a regular decision round where the percentage goes up potentially for out-of-state students.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be one of the more interesting questions heading into April. And I think the three of us are going to find ourselves here talking about that again then. I think that it's also important, and Alyssa, as you are going to the next slide, right, that when you are looking at admission statistics as an out-of-state applicant, most of the time the universities are not breaking average SAT and ACT scores down and average GPA and other stats by in-state applicants versus out-of-state applicants. Yes, we're seeing this data here, right, that Georgia and Georgia Tech have released of how many applicants they got and who was accepted. But when you are on the prospective side of things and you're saying, oh, do I fit into this school? An important note is maybe don't go just based off the averages you see online. If your school has Naviance or some equivalent, like Squire, whatever they're pronouncing it these days, right? Those systems oftentimes have data of how students in previous years have done. It usually shows up in a scattergram where you can see the average grades of those students at your high school and average test scores of students at your high school and how they fared. And that, as I mean, I know we're acknowledging that it changes year to year, but that can be the most indicative data of what test score you may need to hit and what grades you may need to hit.
And it's
But
one of those where, like, I'm sure many of the students who are joining us have, been talked to death about the scientific method and the idea of controlling your variables. If you look at a common data set and you look at that acceptance rate, you are controlling for no variables. You're not controlling for in-state, out-of-state. Depending on the school, you're not controlling for test optional versus submitting test scores versus not submitting test scores. When you get into Naviance, you are not only going, all right, I know I am comparing myself to either in-state applicants where it's applicable, out-of-state applicants when it's applicable, but you're controlling down to the variable of your high school, students who have had the exact same educational opportunities that you have.
yeah. And you know, I want to acknowledge 2 points kind of as we bridge this fewer students are applying early decision as a trend. And a big part of it is the power of these public universities. That is a huge influence on the trends we're seeing. One last point on this, especially with this dynamic of protecting a state's own. There's some states who are doing, right? Wisconsin, Texas. I mean, look at the numbers for Georgia here. If you are a resident, just objectively, you have a higher percentage chance of getting in if you're in state. And I know that California has been making some changes recently, but a running joke we had for years was, there's other states that it becomes far more competitive when you're in state versus applying out of state. Like California, it was like my joke when I gave seminars out there was like, if you are a California resident, and you want to go to UC school, my first piece of advice is move to Arizona, right? Like it was that bad for a while. And they are making an effort. Their guarantee system is a little different and trickier, but this dynamic is important. And when Wisconsin pushed for this Wisconsin guarantee, that was a bipartisan effort that passed through the state legislature. We may see more and more of that in the coming years, which is great if you live in the state, but if you're out of the state, it's going to make things more competitive. But when we're talking about, just the power of these public universities as a whole, they are, I would argue, the single biggest influence on why students are not applying early decision. Because yes, there are early decision schools of these, a lot of people will colloquially call them rah-rah schools, right? The schools with D1 sports, but really it's not D1 sports. Students really just want a football team, right? I keep telling them basketball has more home games, than football. It's only a couple home games a year. This math doesn't seem to work out in students' minds. They really want D1 football schools, right? And I'm like, okay, well, then you should go onto ESPN.com, click on the NCAAF button, scroll down to, where it says teams, and then you have a menu of every school that you can choose from at that point, like that you can build your college list from that menu. It's there. There's no secret schools at that point that have D1 football teams. And look, there's, Vanderbilt beating Alabama this year, which, I'm sure has no influence on their search of early decision applications. Duke, UVA. I mean, there are schools that, Wake Forest that check off these boxes and offer early decisions as well. But there's a lot, and the vast majority of these schools, the SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, Big 12, all these power conferences, they don't offer early decision. And this is what students, valedictorians, salutatorians, top of their class, in every which way, this is what they want, right? And we look at, this data, right? These aren't even the public ones. USC in Los Angeles doesn't have early decision. 8% acceptance rate, early action, 8%. That's lower than Duke's 11.1. That's lower than Yale's, restrictive early action. Georgetown, 11%. Notre Dame, 13%. This is what the market's demanding. This is what they want, no matter what your students' grades are. We hear it all the time. We say, what do you want in a school? We want a school that has a lot of spirit, right? And to be very clear right now, so there's no tone being misunderstood, we are not discouraging or dismissing that or diminishing that in any way, right? Because there are hundreds and thousands of universities out there that are amazing. You have to limit it down somehow. And quite frankly, superficialities, right? That could be weather, distance from home, if they have a football team. Superficialities are oftentimes the greatest ways to build a healthy college list and cut out a lot of other options and eliminate the noise, right? So we're not diminishing it, but what we're acknowledging here is these schools are if you were buying stock, these are the hottest stocks right now, right? Their value is skyrocketing every single year, right? As soon as, Deion Sanders became the coach at Colorado Boulder, I was like, yeah, that's a stock I want to buy. SMU has so many billionaire alumni who are pouring money back into that school after the football scandal. It is no coincidence. The football team's going to get better. There's going to be more applications there as well. Not my best example. They do offer early decision, which is a good thing. But, it's just going to be a trend that continues year to year to year. ED is going to be a huge advantage, and the top students are going to continue to not necessarily apply to the old guard. They're not going to ED to the Ivy League. They're not going to ED to the obvious top choices because they want something else. Which then brings us to our last bullet point, which is, I think, the reason that a lot of people are here, whether you have a senior and you're like, what just happened? Right? Whether you're a parent of a junior or sophomore, and you're like hearing these stories about mass deferrals. I think it's worth noting that, again, there's the macro and then there's the micro. The macro is that these mass deferrals are not new. This has been happening for years. Like so much else, it was accentuated and accelerated by the pandemic. When application numbers surged and these universities went test optional, and all of a sudden they didn't know how to handle this. And what happened was, I think the mindset is if we are absolutely certain we are going to accept you, we're accepting you in the regular decision round. If we are absolutely certain that even in the regular decision round, we are not accepting you, we will deny you. And then you have this huge body of students in the middle who have the grades and have the test scores and wrote amazing essays and have impressive activities and have great recommendation letters from counselors and teachers. And they got deferred because these schools are saying, well, we want to see the rest that comes in, regular decision. We want to go through this again. And we need to check our institutional priorities, right? Things that are not in your control, mind you, right? As a student and as an applicant, and you'll never know what those institutional priorities were. And this has happened for years, right? Michigan, I'm just gonna can't end you can't end a state of early admissions webinar without talking about Michigan. I think Michigan made it very far this year without being acknowledged, but Michigan has done this for years, right? To the point where for many, many years, we had a special newsletter we sent out the day after Michigan deferrals were released that said, we know we had honest conversations with you about how Michigan tends to defer the vast majority of its applicants every year. If you know other people who are shell-shocked right now because they weren't given this guidance, they can call us. And we got calls from strangers every single year who we counseled and supported and had to educate after the fact. It was really painful, right? Now everyone knows what Michigan does because they've been consistent.
And it is one of those where for Michigan, it's one of those institutional priority things
Yep.
where Michigan treats their early action round in many ways. Not entirely. They do admit some out-of-state students, but they look at their early action round as a way to ensure that they meet the in-state percentages imposed by their legislature.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'm going to give Georgia and Georgia Tech a lot of credit for being transparent about that and just going, no, we have two separate rounds for in-state and out-of-state students because I think it can be really frustrating for families who have put in a lot of work to receive a deferral and go, no, there was nothing about you in this, but there was a particular priority that the institution wanted to accomplish in this round. I think we've we had a student accepted to Harvard and deferred at Michigan this year
Yep.
because it was an out-of-state student. And that, Michigan's primary concern in early action was in state.
Yeah. And it also goes to yield manipulation too, right? I mean,
Yes.
it's a whole bunch of stuff. Um, you know, Alyssa, before I know you want to talk about best practices on following up with deferrals, the only thing I would
Mhm.
say is, there's the acknowledgement of the macro. The micro, never seen so many deferrals at South Carolina before,
Mhm.
right? Florida, so many. And you just see school to school. Wisconsin, right? Wisconsin. Can't believe I almost finished that sentence for that. Wisconsin, right? And we're trying to illuminate the stories behind some of these trends and why there's so many deferrals. It's not always as simple as, oh, there's just more applications each year, right? There's stories behind this. So Alyssa, to kind of close this out before we get the Q&A, what are the best practices at this point if you get deferred?
So I I feel like we're coming back to macro and micro story here because the best practice in there is going to be look at your deferral letter and then do exactly what it tells you to do and nothing else. There will be schools who the only thing they want is that first semester of your senior year grades, and that's all they want. There may be schools that, will accept a letter of continued interest, and I can chat a little bit about how you write one of those too. There will be schools that go, no, we want one update and we want it here and nowhere else. There will be some where all they want you to do is click a button saying yes or no. Listen to the school. Admissions officers are people in that, yes, they accept people, but also they are very overburdened right now and do not need 10 letters with, you know, every detail of everything a student has been doing since they submitted their application. But if you do choose to write a letter of continued interest, be kind, be considerate, get someone else to read it before you send it. You know, we even have each other read our emails because sometimes the typo just slips through the third time you've rewritten a sentence. And try and choose updates that are substantive and specific that, could help an admissions officer see who you are, a little bit more clearly rather than reiterating, anything that you've already put in your application.
And again, it has to be about you, right? Like that's wonderful if your football team won the state championship, right? Like we're really happy for your football team. What role did you play? Did you start? What position were you? Did you score a touchdown in the playoffs too? This is the difference. And it's amazing. It may, if you're listening to this and you go, well, that sounds so obvious. It's not, right? Because so often what we get is just a summary of the activity and it says nothing about the student. It's the comment on essays, deferral follow-ups, everything else. It's the most unoriginal and most popular comment. It's like, talk more about yourself, right? Like you need to use specific personal details. And, this is your last shot at communicating with the school. If they're giving you this chance, right? Like you better talk about yourself because they're accepting you, not your dance team or your football team or your theater troupe, right? It's you. And you got to be your own salesperson. So, should we do Q&As?
Let's do it. Okay, so I'll take us through the Q&A, and I'll hand these out to Eric and Alyssa as I see fit.
And before we do, as we start wrapping up, first of all, a huge thank you to Jim and Alyssa tonight. Huge thank you to all of you who signed on live for being here. And if you made it this far in the YouTube recording, thanks for listening to the whole thing. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us ever. Here's our contact information. We want to answer your questions. We want to be here for you. Um, we've always, we really value educating and empowering families. The goal of tonight is not to overwhelm you with information to the point that you feel stressed or anxious. The point is to empower you so you can go out and when other parents are talking about things, you can be like, no, 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 no. I know this and share this information and share this webinar. Our whole value system and ethos is to empower students and parents as we guide them through the process, which is why we're going to answer all these questions now. So keep sending what you have too. Jim?
All right, question number one. Do any of these top tier schools pre-screen applications for interviews? Most interviews seem to be based on alumni availability, but I was wondering if any particular school is known to pre-screen. Eric?
I mean, my answer instead of answering that is like alumni interviews just don't matter that much slash at all. They don't impact the application. There are very few schools where interviews matter. It's not the alumni interviews that happen after you submit. They're oftentimes through the admissions office. So, you know, I would say just don't worry about this, right? A lot of times interviews are literally just offered based on availability.
Yeah, an
One
important
of
way to get to understand alumni interviews is that they're more of a strategy on the school's behalf to engage their alumni and make them feel like they're still a part of the school community, so they keep donating and attending events and things like that. And it's not so much a factor in the actual admissions process. And that's because admissions officers are highly trained to do this process, align with the school's values. Alumni are not. So, you can't be putting too much stock in what a random alumni has to say about a student. It's not fair to the student to do it that way. But it's a great opportunity for students, I would say, honestly, just from like a personal and professional development standpoint, to have an interview that's low stakes, and also just ask the alumni for advice and information about the school at the same time.
one of the other questions we get a lot is about essentially if you do happen to, you know, if there is an alumni interview available, what can the impact be? And it is generally if a student goes into an interview and just absolutely blows it out of the water, it can be a net, it can be a net positive in that it's something that the admissions officers consider, but it is almost never the be all end all of a application. I will say one of the interesting things we saw develop this year is Duke has just started to introduce evaluative interviews as part of their process. This is new of this year, so that's really something that we are starting to keep an eye on as we're hearing, from our early decision acceptees from Duke and waiting on our regular decision acceptances as well.
Next question. Are there any trends to note for international applicants that we've noticed specifically in the early round?
Not enough to be worth a notable conversation. I would say that's something we can keep an eye on for the regular decision round when all the dust settles.
All right. Another question. What would explain a denial from the University of Illinois, UT Austin, and Georgia Tech for a student with a 1590 SAT, 4.3 GPA, comprehensive list of activities and internship as a resident of California?
Well, first of all, I'm assuming based on that list, perhaps unfairly, but I'm going to assume not that the student's an engineering student. Um, which, and if I'm wrong on engineering, my next guess is going to be business. Engineering and business tend to be harder than a standard arts and sciences applicant. Um, I think comprehensive list of activities and internship can be subjective, so I can't comment on that. But if I'm taking that at face value, uh, I would say the essay, right? I don't know for a fact, or could be a letter of recommendation, to be honest with you, right? Where, maybe there was some flag that was raised by a teacher or a counselor, and that spooked, the admissions officers. Um, I don't know. There's almost always an explanation. And this is why I think when parents and students talk to each other, and you go online and you read these blogs, I mean, people are giving you the highlights, right? I don't know what the lowlights could be potentially. There could be real explanations here. I don't know. I think we should move on to the next question because it's impossible to know.
Right. The other thing I'll add, an element in these kinds of situations can be yield protection. If a school just thought, oh, well, that student isn't likely to come here anyway, then we've seen students be, you know, accepted literally this year, accepted to Harvard and denied by Michigan. So it's very possible to, kind of have a school just assume, oh, well, they're not going to attend anyway, so we're not going to take the risk to our yield. Next question, near and dear to my heart, a standardized testing question. So, do you think with more schools requiring test scores that the average scores will start to come down a bit? The average ACT and SAT scores right now seem incredibly high. Definitely, if overnight every school required test scores, the average test scores at most schools would go down. They might not go down at the tippy top end of the spectrum, where most of those students who are applying are, applying with super strong scores anyway, and going back to requiring scores there, sometimes just it basically just ends up deterring students who don't have those scores from applying in the first place. So it doesn't bring down the averages necessarily. And we're talking at like top 10 schools in terms of selectivity. But in general, in the test optional world, most colleges are admitting 40 to 60% of their students with test scores, right? And the missing 40 to 60% of test scores from the students who aren't submitting them are the lower 40 to 60% of those test scores. So if every student who applied was just forced to send their test scores, then of course the averages would come down. But again, at the very, very high end of selectivity, they're not going to come down, or they're not going to come down very much, just because of the students who tend to apply to those schools and the fact that the reinstatement of the requirement would discourage students with lower scores from applying in the first place. All right, another question. What about job offers at the end of college? Should we consider that? And I assume this means in college list formation. Should we consider that? And is it possible to find that data? Alyssa, can you speak to this?
Eric, I saw you about to answer, so if you want to take this one, you can go for it. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is I know there is a statistic out there at this point that like most adults are going to change careers 3 times over the course of their life. So while looking at job placement data can be important, um, that qualitative fit component when it comes to forming a college list is going to be still hugely important. If, unless you're applying for marine biology or to be a pilot, in which case, call me, I have your college list for you already. There are going to be strong programs with strong outcomes in many of the locales that a student would be looking for. But if we're looking at specific majors, And specifically when it comes to career outcomes. This is somewhat counterintuitive, but the smaller and more specialized schools for a given major or a given field can often have the best outcomes for that field. They may not have necessarily the best football teams, but you know, when engineers are going to hire, they're possibly going to very specific, highly technical engineering schools because they know their own industry in a way that is knowledgeable and intimate in a way that other people don't. And it is something to keep in mind if a student is really set on a specific thing. And the example I often give is, the best school for plastics and polymer engineering is the University of Massachusetts Lowell. It's not their flagship campus. It's a satellite campus. But if that is specifically what you want to do with your life, that is going to be the best place to go.
So there's a couple comments and questions here about money related topics. We are going to skip them. It's not normally the wheelhouse in which we deal. One of them was seeking for us to comment on the fact that early decision helps financially advantage families. I just want to acknowledge that if you are accepted early decision and you show that you are not able to financially afford the institution, that is the one way, if nothing else, to break an early decision binding agreement. And we do appreciate the attendee who asked, how do we get the cool Ivy, the snazzy Ivy swag that we're wearing? The next question is, I've heard that AI is reading essays. Well, what will that mean for the way that kids write their essays? I think that, first of all, if AI is, we talk a lot about here about, what's in your control versus what's out of your control. And to me, I read this and I go, well, let's try to humanize this question and bring it back to more, bring it back a couple of years. You can't control who's reading your essay anyways, even when you know it's a human. Humans come with their own biases, their own predispositions, their own experiences and perspectives and values. We are all unconsciously biased. And I don't mean this in big ways, right? Like, I'm sorry, I really like wildlife and birds in particular. Like, I'm if if someone's gonna write an essay about birds, it's just gonna stay with me in a different way, even if it is not the best essay. And I'm not saying I'm gonna admit that kid then over someone else who wrote about robots, but you know, so what if AI is reading the essay? You, as the applicant, all you can control is that you write the best, most personally insightful essay as possible. And if they are programming AI to read your damn essay, like, look, the reality is, like, they're going to tell the AI, give extra points to the student who shows critical self-reflection and thought, give extra points to the student who shares details and insights into their lives and their values. So, I don't know. I would really hate the day that AI is reading, my students' essays, but like the only comfort I'm going to take is that, boy, that AI's rubric, whatever they input it with, is going to love whatever our students submit because we've known for a long time what colleges and humans are looking for. So that's my answer there.
All right. Do schools publish what percentage or what a student's chances to get in are after a deferral? I've never seen that data. Have you guys?
I wish they would.
That'd be
That would
nice. Yeah, that'd be very nice, but I have never seen
be
that in
so
my life.
nice.
Yeah.
We can go on. Let's love that data.
Yes. Take a look at, if you have a specific school in mind, the places where that data would be, because some schools do speak to that on an individual level for that school. That information is going to be either in the deferral notification that you received, or there is likely going to be a deferral FAQ on that school's website. If they choose to disclose any information along those regards, it's going to be there.
Well said. Another question. Are senior fall grades sent to regular decision schools or just to early action or early decision schools if a student's deferred?
Um, a lot of times the universities will request them, but if not, I mean, look, again, let's not generalize here, right? Or even try to guess. If you're a student who knocked it out of the park first semester and you nailed it, you have straight A's, let's say, I mean, I would be marching into the guidance office the first thing the day after I get that updated transcript and saying, I want this sent to every school, or getting it and then uploading it into every admissions portal, which is really the way that a lot of schools operate right now is when you submit the application, you then get a portal and then you can upload updates. And generally speaking, the one update that any school is going to let you do is anything academic related or transcript related. So I would ask, the high school, but if it's not done automatically, take it in control and do it. If you haven't already.
Well said. What are the benefits of starting the college prep process with students as young as ninth or 10th grade? What does the process look like with students that young? Do you feel this really benefits them and how? And I'll let Eric handle this one because he literally gave a TEDx talk on this very topic.
This is
Yeah,
your favorite thing. Go.
it is my favorite thing. So, I mean, look, I gave a TEDx talk that talks about the one brainstorming question that we ask at the beginning of the essay process, which is, what do we need to know about you? And the funny thing is that everyone thinks and just assumes that I was inspired to give this TEDx talk because I do college essays. It is totally wrong, not at all correct. It's that when students got to that moment of meeting me and answering that question of what do I need to know about you, I got really upset and discouraged that so many students had so much depth. They were so cool, so interesting, dynamic in so many ways. But over the course of ninth and 10th grade, the pressures and social expectations and myths that surround college made them, I hate to say it this way, but just less and less personal and less interesting and less distinguished. They lost themselves because they were living their lives based on what they thought colleges wanted and not what they wanted. And that's why it is, to me, essential to have these conversations in ninth and 10th grade. And even if you just meet with us for an hour, I mean, that hour conversation and resetting expectations and recalibrating, I mean, to me, that's essential for students and their parents all in a room together to hear because it can change the trajectory in the way that you live your life and approach your course selection and intellectual interests. And I mean, especially your activities, which I mean, look, we just got asked about AI. Like, AI can't live your life, AI can't fill out your resume, right? You control your own actions and you make yourself interesting and dynamic and you live your life with depth and substance and meaning and joy, right? I mean, there are essay prompts right now about what do you do for joy or pleasure? And I got to tell you, right? And Alyssa and Jim know this. Those prompts are some of the hardest right now for students to answer because they don't carve out any time for personal pleasure or joy in their lives. And it is obvious. They just start writing about an activity. It's not going to go well in college admissions, right? We really preach the mantra, better person, better applicant. It's not some fluffy line to make everyone feel good, right? Like It's cold hard strategy at the end of the day. Better, happier people who are living better lives are overall going to be better applicants. So, yeah, I mean, have this conversation early. People are scared to have this conversation. People don't think it's time. They want to wait. Don't wait. Just a short conversation can lower the pressure and anxiety so much, and it can transform the high school experience. I could give an hour talk just on that.
I'll add one quick academic point to that. And this is just a very specific example, but you can see this kind of thing play out in other ways. If we have a student who, we know is going to be interested in a STEM field, right? And they're in a math trajectory where they're not going to have taken calculus by the end of senior year. They're going to take algebra 2 as a junior and then, pre-calc or trigonometry, whatever your school calls it as a senior, or maybe you're in an integrated math curriculum and the course titles are different, but it's basically the same. Um, Often, the easiest math course to take over the summer, if a student wanted to accelerate to be able to take calculus by the end of senior year, which is going to be, a kind of soft requirement for a lot of competitive STEM programs, the easiest math class to take over the summer is geometry because it doesn't kind of accumulate the way the others do. Algebra 1 builds directly on, Algebra 2 and then pre-calc, and that's like a strong progression. Concepts from geometry play into the rest of that course sequence, but geometry is in many ways kind of a dead-end course. So taking that one over the summer, where maybe you don't learn it as thoroughly, right, is a lot easier to do. And it's something you can typically only do after ninth or 10th grade. So sometimes course selection wise, you can put yourself into a corner that's a lot more difficult to get out of if you're not talking to someone who has that broader perspective earlier on in the process. So course selection can have consequences as well, in addition to just, like Eric said, setting yourself up on a better extracurricular trajectory for your own personal fulfillment, which is also going to make a better college application. Um, can you talk about recent trends in applications for schools abroad, i.e., or e.g., rather, schools in the UK or Canada? So let me just ask you guys, in the early round, did we get enough returns from schools in the UK and Canada to be able to say anything?
I'll be honest, I think I can speak for Alyssa here too. Um, I know there probably is maybe a trend, especially with, political environments right now in the US. But I think the reality is for us, I think I had the fewest number of students in recent years who applied to any UK or Canadian schools. I'm struggling.
Canada's cold.
Canada, Canada is so cold. It's true. But yeah, I really, yeah, we can't speak to that because we didn't see that internally. So I didn't
And I
even.
think honestly that is a market shift because we have consistently in previous years had students apply to UK schools, had students apply to schools in Canada, and had them do quite well.
Yeah,
But I think it is one of those trends that we're seeing, which, for 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 whatever reason, people seem to be applying within the United States. So it's not that, when we have applications, we don't get good results. It's just, I
yeah.
don't think we had students apply.
No, it's just coincidence. And this is, by the way, why we love our community and our families. Kudos to the person who said Syracuse is very cold too, but still very popular, which is true. It's very
Macro
popular.
stories and micro stories, the theme of the night. All right.
They
If
have
you've
a great sports team.
true, true. If you've been deferred, how might the admissions committee review a deferred applicant versus someone who applied regular decision? Do they tend to come in last, as in, do the deferred applicants tend to come in last when reviewing applications from the same school so they can make comparisons? So, in other words, is having been deferred a disadvantage once you get to that regular decision applicant pool?
No,
No.
they're reviewed in the regular decision applicant pool, and again, you still there's a consideration that that student submitted earlier. Um, and demonstrated that level of interest and had the opportunity to provide updates. Plus, I don't know. Do you want to build on that?
I think in a word, no. We have, counseled students from dozens of schools who have been deferred. Across the board, the messaging is you will be considered the same way that any other regular decision applicant is.
I'll add
Also,
just,
please send us your fall semester senior year grades.
yeah, I'll add in speaking, one of our colleagues, Jordan Holmes, is a former admissions officer who's worked at Penn, American, and USC, Southern California, USC, that is. The What he told me is that typically when a student's deferred, their application's actually not even being read by the same admissions officer in the regular pool as it was in the early pool, as a way to give that student a fair shake in the new,
Fresh set of
pool
eyes.
because yeah, they're not someone already kind of decided against them in a way. So, give them a real new chance. And that's how at least institutions he's been at have handled it. Colleges all have internal processes. I'm sure it's not the same across the board, but that's often the case. All right. If my child, currently a junior, is accepted to a school that offers that offers rolling admissions very early during senior year, will the school want to see any grades from senior year? Or will the school simply want to verify in June that my child, in fact, did graduate?
And something in between, they're gonna, want to see that transcript at the end of the year. And I mean, if the subtext of the question is, are they gonna see the grades after you get in? Like, yeah. I mean, if your grades at that point slip from like A's to like A minuses, B pluses, like that's not going to change the decision. They don't rescind based on that. If you go from an A or an AB student, all of a sudden you're getting C's and D's, yeah, they could withdraw the acceptance at that point. So, I mean, look, bottom line is you should practice good habits as you make that bridge to college, and you should just keep up your grades.
Great. And we had another question come in the chat, which is, does legacy admissions matter anymore? Are there any particular schools that care more about legacy than others?
Oh, please let me end the night by talking about the common data set. It's my favorite thing.
Go
Please.
for it.
So, yes, there are schools that still consider legacy to a greater or lesser extent, and you can find out exactly which school this is because the vast majority of schools publish something called the Common Data Set. You can find it quite simply by Googling the name of the university, Common Data Set, and by looking at section C, which is the section that contains a whole swath of super fascinating information about how the school can decides on who to admit and who not. Do you want to know if you should go visit the school? Go and look to see if what level they can, to what point they consider the level of applicants' interest. Um, do you want to know if they do interviews? It's there. Do you want to be able to make fun of Tulane too for the number of students that it admits an early decision? You can find that information in their common data set. And in section C, there is specifically a list of factors that a school can take into consideration when they make their decision. It goes from grades and rigor through things like in-state residence, geography, level of students' interest. Legacy is one of the factors listed in that chart, and schools have 4 options for each factor, either very important, important, considered, or not considered.
So here's just an example. Wisconsin has been the school we keep picking on tonight, so I pulled up Wisconsin's common data set, and you can see alumni relation, which means having a relative who attended there, which means legacy. They say they don't consider it at all. And so you'll find this same section, C7 of the common data set, if you just Google university name common data set and scroll to section C7. And so they tell you how they consider these factors. One thing I'll say about that is that it's a result of the school's self-perception, meaning it's not always going to be perfectly accurate to what the school is doing, but it's how they've decided to, you know, proclaim to the world that they're doing things. All right. Well, thank you so much to those of you who hung around this long live and all of you in the YouTube world who hung with us this long. We really appreciate you turning out. Stay tuned if you're attending live. We'll send tomorrow a link to the YouTube recording, as well as opportunities to work with us further with your student. And if you have any, like I said, questions of a more personal nature, feel free to reach out to us by our website contact form or info@myivexperience.com or 267-888-6489. Thanks and have a great night, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.